くよ。ありがとうございます。
皆さん座った。
それでは時間となりました。
We would now like to start the last session of the day, Parallel Session 2, exploring reduction in the 3 Rs, improving resource efficiency in Asia and the Pacific. Let us start the session without further ado. Already the speakers are on the stage. The moderator for this session is Mr. Hotta, leader of Sustainable Consumption and Production Area of IGES. Mr. Hotta, please. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. This session is about exploring reduction in the 3 Rs, improving resource efficiency in Asia and the Pacific. We are going to discuss resource constraints issues, which is equally important with climate change and biodiversity conservation and so forth. We are going to discuss to explore solutions for resource problems, and also we want to discuss what would be the best way for international cooperation. Today, we have two speakers actually from Europe. And also, we have IGES Senior Fellow, 2 of them. So 4 people will participate in the panel discussion. The Europe and the UNEP is very active in terms of the resource efficiency and the sustainable resource use. In that area, UNEP is very active. So we are going to have the explanation regarding UNEP activities, based on which we are going to have a panel discussion. The speakers today, seated on my left-hand side, viewed from your side, from the left-hand side, Mr. Raymond Blauschewitz, co-director of Material Flows and Resource Management of Wuppertal Institute. And seated next to him is Mr. Xiaoyi Li, Head of Integrated Resource Management Unit and Chief of Secretariat for International Resource Panel of UNEP, and Ms. Chika Aoki, who belongs to my research team at IGES, and she has been studying for a long time about sustainable consumption production. Lastly, Mr. Onogawa, Senior Fellow of IGES. The United Nations Regional Development Center has been headed by him for many years. And Japan took the lead in terms of 3 Rs initiative, and also a 3R promotion forum of Asia is very active in 3 Rs, and Japan has made a great contribution in this regard. And from the perspective of United Nations, Mr. Onogawa took a strong leadership in the area of 3 Rs and the resource efficiency. So I think we have a very distinguished members for our panel discussion today. In terms of the purpose of this session, first of all, we have this outlook together with UNEP and other CSIRO and TERI and other research institutes representative of Europe and Asia, including IGES as well. We jointly published Resource Efficiency, Economics, and Outlook for Asia and the Pacific in 2011. And the policy recommendation issued by this outlook are very meaningful and valuable. So I would like to explain about that first of all. This graph wants to say the following. Asia is becoming a resource-intensive economy. In the past, Asia was consuming only 1/3 of the rest of the world per capita. However, Asian per capita consumption of resources coming to the rest of the world level. And also, in tandem with economic growth, the resource amount necessary to support economic growth is increasing in quantity, particularly in Asia and the Pacific. Compared to 1970, Asia's resource consumption has increased by 6 times by 2005. Furthermore, according to this report, we conducted an analysis. What would be the trends leading into 2050? As a result of the trend analysis, the trend in Asia Pacific will be extremely unsustainable. In particular, if the current situation continues as now, the resource consumption in this region will triple by 2050. And also, as I said earlier, compared to 1970 level, the resource consumption increased by 6 times by now. And compared to present level, the consumption of resource in this region will increase by 3 times. And we have to consider resource efficiency while we try to maintain or achieve higher economic growth. So the aim of this session is as follows. Now, Asia-Pacific region has to move toward resource-efficient economies. What kind of opportunities are there? What kind of specific steps can we take? That's something we want to discuss today. And also, we have been promoting recycling in a quite successful way. However, we should go beyond recycling in order to solve resource issues. What could they do? Particularly, what would be the future vision necessary in order to build a sustainable Asian region while conserving resource use? We would like to have inputs from our speakers today. First of all, I would like to call upon Mr. Raymond Vleishubis to give a keynote speech. Now I hand over to you.
Thank you. Dear Dr. Hotta-san, dear panelists, dear people here, experts in the room, thank you very much indeed for this excellent introduction and the overview about the topic. What I would like to do with you in the next 20 minutes or so is to follow the instructions by the chair, and in particular guide you a little bit through the discussion on how a real reduction could be achieved by means of policies and markets. And in doing so, I would like to point to some trends which I've seen in the last month to come, which might be of importance to you. There is indeed a number of resource-related conflicts around. And probably one of the most prominent of those conflicts is the conflict here in the South Chinese Sea between Japan and China, which at the surface is about the islands, but indeed it also is related to the offshore mining opportunities which might exist there. The second trend relates to what we currently see in the global energy markets, in that North America, Canada, and United States have come back with regard to unconventional fuel production. And the third trend is related to an event which was recently in Berlin, where the US President Obama surprised the observers with the statement, which I very much like, I must say, that complacency is not the attitude of great nations. And probably it was referring to a potential German leadership, but I think it also applies to a country like Japan and maybe other reasons, that there is no reason to lay back. And in particular, he also emphasized the American approach, or his willingness to become tougher on the climate change policy things. And what is also interesting with a relation to resources is the wave of transparency-related initiatives, and the most recent to it was a G8 decision done in Northern Ireland recently in Lough Erne, that there should be more transparency in the extractive sector around the world, and we'll come back to that later, which means the whole picture is very dynamic when it comes to resource efficiency and resource-related policy issues. And indeed, it has been mentioned by Hotta-san, the current trends are unsustainable. We did some recent calculation with colleagues from India saying that the growth potential is there, but if the growth is combined with our increasing resource intensity, then indeed many challenges have to be faced. But when we turn this question of trends to geological surveys and organizations and ask them whether there is a sufficient supply of most materials, the standard answer is yes. Because more mining capacity, more exploration, more extractive activities have been going on. There are more countries which have joined the agenda and the landscape of extraction and mining recently, and quite a number of them have emerged here in Asia. You can refer to the Central Asian countries, including Mongolia, but also Vietnam, Myanmar, and many other countries which have joined the club of the resource-rich and the resource-producing countries. Nevertheless, it's also interesting to see that when you compare the resource dependencies, that not only Europe is very much dependent on the imports of almost all natural resources, but also the majority of the Asian countries, not only Japan, but also China, and, well, to an extent, also India. The important point here is that it has to do not only with the supply of basic materials, which might be abundantly available, such as bauxite or iron ore, but it has very much to do with what we call the global resource nexus. You cannot do any extraction without the use of water, without possessing land, without access to other physical inputs. And therefore, the constraint does not only come from, say, sensitive ecosystems alone, but from using other resource inputs which might be locally scarce, which is related to water scarcity, to food scarcity, and to other local issues. The case of the Chinese dam program might be instructive here. At the surface, it is meant to meet the increasing energy demand in China. On the other hand, we see that it goes along with construction materials that might that are needed, plus the demand for critical materials, and indeed there is a whole conflict landscape downstream when the river management for those dams inhibits and raises potential conflicts with almost all Asian nations. So the reasons to do resource efficiency are manifold, I would state. It is not only the environmental agenda, it is also the political agenda, call it raw material security, and it is, and I'm an economist, it's also a matter of cost reduction, which might be in particular relevant for Japan. I realized that the famous Abenomics are pretty much successful so far, but they come at a cost. Because of the lower value of the yen, this leads to higher risk for importing commodities into Japan. So the whole cost issue will become more important for the years to come. And I may also say, with a reference to the morning discussion, the climate change policy agenda indeed is very much important. But given the potential for cost savings here and the risks that are also associated to managing resources, there is a potential synergy and a potential coalition, in particular for the next few years to come, when we embark on the agenda of resource efficiency. So for a country like Germany, but also for most countries, indeed, the decisive question is, can we absolutely decouple? Can we reduce the amount of resources used while still maintaining the manufacturing base? And the modeling exercises we did for Germany, but we also did it for the European Union, they clearly reveal that growth is possible, while at the same time, and I may shift your attention here to the lower right quadrant of that slide, an absolute reduction is possible, not only with regard to CO2 reduction, where we could realize in the modeling exercise a reduction of 50% CO2 emissions, but also 20 to 25% of the materials, including the hidden flows and what we call the ecological rucksacks. And that's enormous, and that has stimulated the debate in the European Union and is probably one of the reasons why the European Union has promoted resource efficiency as one of the key flagship initiatives for the years to come. So what does it mean? Does it come all along with market forces? No. The modeling has been based on policies, and we have tried to be creative in designing such policy, not only with regard to, say, the usual suspicious, but with a number of instruments which should fuel a policy mix. And here we thought about resource taxation, where we have modeled a construction material tax. We also looked at the potential of different products, key product groups, to have a much better resource efficiency performance. We looked at the taxation issue in general, where the VAT, the value-added tax, is one of the candidates which still gives some disincentives. In Germany, for instance, food is quasi-subsidized because it receives a lower taxation rate, which indeed gives incentives to eat more meat. This is one of the incentives which can be reversed. And there is a more internationally or recycling-oriented instrument, which I will explain in a minute, which we call an international metal covenant. So what you see with a policy mix like this is that the different stages of the value chain are going to be addressed, plus there is a number of cross-cutting issues which have to do with reporting, with certification, with the building up of networks and alliances that help in particular manufacturing companies to improve on their material bill. Having said this, this was design of policies, proposals by some researchers. As I said, there is a wave of ideas floating around in Europe. There is a debate about national targets, about a European target for resource efficiency. You even see some documents where the aim of lowering primary resource use is referred to. And what has been a stimulus is what is called a roadmap for resource efficiency that the European Commission wrote actually twice. There was first a communication and then the final roadmap document. And more recently, the Commission established what they call a European resource efficiency platform, where not only the commissioners meet, but also policymakers from the member states and some NGOs and some big companies and a limited number of academics. The idea is here to have a forum where those ideas can be discussed on a frequent basis, plus a number of other initiatives which you see here. So where does it lead to? The International Resource Panel, which is fortunately represented here at the panel, suggests, and I fully subscribe to it, that over the long run, the industrialized countries should aim at an absolute reduction, while there is indeed a need for developing countries to catch up, to eradicate poverty, so that over the long run, there should be a convergence of the per capita material use between the different countries. So when we nevertheless look at the scenarios, and this is really a premature stage, it is by far not secure, not yet ensured, that resource efficiency will be the key strategy. The whole conflict agenda is still with us, and what it needs is a new type of global cooperation that actively promotes actors in society. We call them change agents, because you first establish niches where you need players in those niche markets for resource-efficient products. Then you need agenda setters, opinion leaders, people who force other people to follow. while at the same time, this should be complemented by better institutions. Agents won't be able to do it alone. You also need to improve along the stages of the resource efficiency agenda, which means the process innovation are a key, but also better coordination along the value chains and new incentives for new value creation. So what does that mean? Indeed, one has to look at the drivers and barriers to a great transformation. Research can try to identify such drivers and barriers, and the statement I would like to make right here is that indeed policies and the kind of change processes remove those processes, lower the barriers, and enable the drivers. Which then at the end of the day means that market failures as a system failures ought to be removed by a proper policy mix. So to have a sort of interim conclusions, policies are indeed important to overcome market distortions, to counteract also international imbalances. Business is quite essential to grasp not only the low-hanging fruits, but also to become more proactively involved to realize what McKinsey and others call a resource revolution. To do this, to align the actors, one needs a sort of indicators which in particular looks at the more comprehensive picture. The lesson learned at the international scale is probably less bright because predominantly resource efficiency is a local issue, a manufacturing issue, a domestic issue, but not yet an international issue. What exists, and that is interesting, is the transparency agenda, whereas the whole efforts to regulate or better steer international commodity markets are not a success story. All the agreements of the 70s and 80s mainly have been phased out. They are ignored or they have been abandoned. So the clearer orientation on the international scale is lacking. And what I would suggest, along with a number of other colleagues, is that one needs to get a clearer picture regarding the knowledge base. There is not yet an international agency in place. There is no complementary forum to the International Energy Agency. There is indeed the International Resource Panel, but I would think that the authority, the continuity is yet lower compared to International Energy Agency and those well-established things. And I'm looking forward to a discussion on those things. So having an international data hub would also be one of the steps forward. The data exists, but it's not yet connected, plus indeed that there are a few gaps that need to be addressed. And a resource agency finally could help to organize more training programs, to develop scenarios so that there is a clearer picture on the trends of the commodity and on the resource markets. Would that speak against policies? Of course not. There are a few key areas where more initiatives should be formulated. There is a phosphorus urgency. There is also the idea of an international metal covenant. There is a number of existing bilateral partnerships that can be transformed to include more aspects of sustainable resource management. And those initiatives, those policy pillars, then should be designed to help to green also the whole world economy, where probably one of the key first initial steps could be an attempt to coordinate the phasing out of environmentally harmful subsidies. So having mentioned this international metal covenant, this is probably one of the more business-oriented ideas, given, and this is one of the findings of the International Resource Panel, that the recycling rates for key materials and metals are shockingly low, with a few exceptions in a few countries. There is a huge interest to improve or to coordinate better the international recycling markets, and a platform where recycling companies and metal processing companies and key downstream industries, for instance from automotive, could join. The key countries would be able to help establish better metal recycling facilities worldwide. Probably on a number of levels, it is foreseeable that base metals can better be recycled at the local level because of the need to transport them, whereas critical materials probably can be dealt better at a global or international scale where a few highly specialized treatment facilities could be introduced. And indeed, there are a number of cases. This is just to give you some pictures. In the middle of my presentation or toward the end of my presentation, I collected this from European evidence to show that it is not only, say, the like-minded countries, but also countries like Belgium, like Lithuania, and many of the smaller countries where those ideas have started to float. Does this mean that there is a difficulty to challenge mining? No. I would think that mining at the end of the day should also be interested to become more engaged, more integrated in the downstream activities. In particular, when we look at Asia, when, say, 20 years from now, many of the cities, many of the infrastructures that is being built right now need to be maintained and replaced, where also the expertise of mining companies and refinery and processing companies will be needed. And coming to an end, the transparency issue, this is really ranking high on the international agenda quite recently. It's not done with the scope to improve resource efficiency, but it's incredibly important. And the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative does a great job in fostering these activities in a number of countries. However, what I would suggest is that more stages of the life cycle should be included. This is what you see in the red type of value chain, including the recycling efforts, and at the same time, the multi-stakeholder groups that are being introduced at the level of states could also be utilized to establish a national action plan forum to foster sustainable resource management in general in those countries, which altogether could lead to a much better international facility to have more evidence on what actually goes on the ground. So I'm coming to an end. What would be my conclusion? Some of the recommendations. I think, yes, resource efficiency, if done well, can deliver decoupling in all markets, in all countries, not only in, say, key industrialized countries. Real reductions, however, require additional efforts from business, policy, and other actors to start to kick off system eco-innovation. Nevertheless, for the next years to come, I suggest that a key is to kick off early action where process innovation, simple process innovation for manufacturing industry along the material value chain is a key to engage business, in particular small and medium-sized enterprises, which also allows, and it needs some additional efforts for capacity building, where UNEP does a great job, but also regional agencies can be established. A system eco-innovation, this is indeed more the mid to long-term perspective. This is much more ambitious. It's more fascinating from a researcher's perspective. And I guess this is also what drives most of you in the midterm. And I guess it can be done, but it should also be done at an international level. And the Asia-Pacific cooperation certainly is a key aspect in that. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for broad-based presentation. You covered a broad ground. Why is it that resource constraint is a problem? And also you focus on key discussion points. Also, you made a concrete proposal regarding policies. If you look at each and every one of those policies, they do exist already. In addition to that, rather than implementing those policies one by one, combination of different policies would go a long way in order to raise resource efficiency and reduce the consumption of resources, and also thus that would provide more job opportunities as well. And also international use of metal, namely International Metal Covenant, was also explained. And the exploration activities have to be more transparent such more recent proposal has been explained as well. Next speaker is Mr. Xiaoyi Li. He is from UNEP. He is chief of the Secretariat of International Resource Panel. International Resource Panel is a resource version of IPCC, as is often said. The experts in the area of resources come together to discuss resource issues from a multifaceted perspectives. So, Mr. Xiao Li, I hand over to you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to address this conference, this forum. I came from Paris, and there is one office of UNEP based there. So I'm very glad to be here. I thank IT to invite us to share our thought, some information with you with regard to the resource efficiency. So my presentation will focus following storyline. Firstly, I want to give a very broad brush in the description about the material flow on the global scale. Talk and set the setting about the resource efficiency and for the different countries. Then I want to elaborate a little bit what is the decoupling, which is a motto of International Resources Panel. So we promote decoupling, but there is a different understanding about the decoupling. I want to clarify about the decoupling in our view. Then I want to show a few specific examples how we can materialize the decoupling, how we can influence and improve the resource efficiency in the land use, in the metal, and also in the urbanization process. Last, I just want to share some thought about the methodology to look at the resources issue. Because of time constraint, I'm not going to go all of my slides, and some slides I will go very quick. I understand the organizer of the forum will put my presentation on the website. You can go to there to get the detail, and each of the data, they have the source of those data, and you can also download our report from the website. This slide mentions the long time span, the resources used, from the last century, from the beginning of the 1990s until now. Over the last over 100 years, the resources power the economic growth. The natural resources use has increased by a factor of 8 to support the economic growth by a factor of 23. Here they have the detail and by what resources increased by what times. I'm not going to get the detail, but that means resources is critical to the human beings of survival, to the economical development, and to the well-being. This slide shows the price of the natural resources has been fluctuating, has been very volatile, particularly basically until the 1990s. The price, the long-term trend is a decline. Started from the 1990s, the price goes up until now. Some price like fossil fuel, oil, natural gas, already triple. Some mineral resources already double. And also we have not seen any sign of the price will go down. This slide mentioned in the different component of the resources increase. You can see fossil fuel still play a big role. Fossil fuel is dominating the resources, global resources flow and the trade. This is the grade, the material or in industry minerals or grade, they have come down. And this figure shows in 5 countries over the last century, the quality or grade of industry ores has decreased by a factor of 2 to 4. What is the environmental impact of those degradation? Because you want to get the same amount of the metal, you have to dig deeper, use more energy, use more water, and also occupy more land. This slide shows the shift of the extractive industry. We can see in the developing country, the extractive industry has shifted more to the developing country. What is the environmental impact of that? Because in the developing country, because of many, many reasons, technology reasons, investment reasons, governance reasons, they have the loose regulation in terms of the environment. You dig out the same amount of the minerals, you may cause more damage, environmental damage. This slide shows, over the last 50 years, international trade. This is a material trade. Some is a direct material, take material as a commodity. Some is manufacturing goods that contains a high content of the material. Actually, the indirect material commodity increased by about 4.5, 4.6 times. Meanwhile, the material content in the manufacturing goods has increased over 7 times. The more goods, and also that's also confirmed that many manufacturing industry has been shifted from the OECD country, developed country, to the developing country. This is the shift, the pattern of the shift. We can see, in terms of the international resources flow or trade, North America, African country, Latin America, their share more or less remained. The big changes is between Asia and Europe. Asia's share has been increased, while the European, their resources flow, including the import, export, altogether has been decreased. This slide, I think many people are already seeing that. I just want to emphasize Asia. The change is so dramatic in here. Until the 1990s, Asia as a whole has been the resources exporting region. Since then, Asia has become the largest, one of the largest, only next to Europe, the resources import region. This slide, in a way, International Resources Panel has used one approach they call the metabolic rate, which means the resources consumption per capita per year. We find out that the resources, this metabolic rate has the two relevance. One, relevant to the income. The higher income, the rate will be higher. The lower income, the rate will be lower. For instance, in US and North America country, their resources use per capita per year as high as 32 to 34 tons. Meanwhile, in South Asia, Bangladesh, India is about 2 to 4 tons. That is a correlation with the income. Another relation, we find out the metabolic rate is, will be high for the urban area, will be low for the urban area, which is a contrast with the population density. The more people, more dense of the population, the less metabolic rate, which change a lot of idea, gave some kind of a consideration in favor of the urbanization in terms of the environment. For the same level of the living standard, people living in the city consume less resources than those living in the rural area. This is just another way to show different country how much their rate is. I go very quickly for that. This, just mentioned, I think a few people already mentioned that, globally, the resources intensity has been declined every year by 1 to 2%. But for Asia, has been increased. Several people already mentioned that. I don't get detail. This is about the so-called sink. Actually, this is very vivid. For the scale of the planet, globe, one is the atmosphere. The other dot, small dot, is water. What happened is, over the last, since the Industrial Revolution, the people dig out more fossil fuel and use that, emit a great amount of the emission, the CO2 in the atmosphere. Meanwhile, we fixed the NOx, the nitrogen. You change that into the fertilizer for the agricultural production, then cause a serious eutrophication problem, pollute the water, river, and also coast area. How to address that? We promote decoupling. What is the decoupling? 3 points. One, absolute decouple between the economic growth and the environmental degradation, which is achievable, already achieved in OECD countries, in Japan, in Europe, in North America. The second point is do more for less, which is more applicable to emerging economy, to the developing countries. For those countries, they have to develop. They need development to eliminate the poverty. But for that development, they cannot follow the OECD country pattern in terms of the resources use. They have to develop the faster with less resources intensity. The last is do less for less, which is more applicable for OECD, for rich country. For rich country, their metabolic rate must be reduced, must be come down. We do some scenario analysis. If we keep the business as usual, we need 3 planets to support by 2050. Another thing is if OECD country, developed country, can lower their intensity, can reduce their metabolic rate by 50%, by that time, developing country coming up, we still need 2 planets. Then I show some example about the specific studies. One is the land. Because we do the study from a so-called life cycle. From the supply part, we look at how much land change had reduced the crop land. From the forest to the grassland to the crops land. And also, they also have the built environment, which is for urban, for town. When we do the urbanization, we have to consider this factor. The other, we look at the supply part, how much demand for the biomass produced by the land, which include the 3 Fs, food, fiber, fuel. We find out there is a big gap in between. So then, in our study, we also make few kind of the policy relevant recommendation to change this. I'm going a little bit into a little detail on that, which first and relatively, we can do without many new technology, which is reduced consumption for some overconsumed country. Reduced food waste is one of way. Then we have to restore and stop the soil deterioration. Actually, every year, the crop loss, productivity loss from the soil deterioration is equal to the gain from the land expansion. Then we have to improve the efficiency of the biomass use, including like paper, timber, all those use we have to increase. The last, we have to delink the market between food and the biofuel. I'm not going to elaborate that, but you can see why we need to delink that. Because at this moment, in North America, in Europe, the government subsidizes agriculture. That means they subsidize biofuel. Then I want to get a little bit of detail, because Raymond just mentioned the metal work. International Resources Panel has published the 4 reports on metal. First, we look at how much metal already in the society. Second, we look at how much theoretical rate of the recycling for different metal. The third report, we look at what is the technology available, what is the facility available to do the recycling, to improve the recycling rate. The last report will assess the recycling rate with the environmental impact. Those reports are already available in our website. You can download. There is a very detailed information on that. So basically, the situation was very gloomy. Of the 60 different elements from the periodic table, only 12 of them recycling rate is over 50%. For most critical metal, is less than 1%. Then city. Although this forum did not focus on the city issue, but the city is very, very important. It is, they consume over 70% of the resources. Although they did not generate natural resources come from outside city, but the consumption happens in the city. They emit over 80% of the GHG. And also, now the urbanization, it is opportunity, as just now we mentioned, in terms of population density and metabolic rate. Now the urbanization could be the opportunity. If we don't handle that well, that can land the hundreds million people into the city's slum. That's why we did a study. We find out this is the opportunity. Because of time reason, again, I'm not going to get the detail. Again, on this issue, urbanization process, mostly in the developing country. And the developing country cannot follow, or the planet cannot afford developing country to follow the OECD pattern in the urbanization, which is very resources intensity and pollution. Finally, this last slide, we look at the issue. When we look at the resources efficiency issue, we look at from the biomass-based, bio-based, mineral-based, look into the economic as the instrument, look at the market, what is the market mechanism to facilitate, to scale up the innovations. Then finally, we think about the people. And everybody already pay attention to the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal debate. There are many different opinions, but I think there is one point, most people reach the consensus, which is a neutral, which is a future SDG, must be human or people-centered, environment or ecosystem sensitive. If SDG process can achieve that, I think that is a good set of SDG, and also resources efficiency certainly can make a contribution to these goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing with us the most recent findings at the International Resource Panel. Thank you so much. In particular, this panel addresses very complicated issues, for example, land use issues, urbanization issues. In each of these very complicated issues, I believe the International Resource Panel has shown a direction to resolve them. In particular, my understanding is that when it comes to biofuel, it was very enthusiastically received a few years ago. However, the panel, in a very level-headed manner, already found that this could not be a sustainable resolution. So I think the panel helped to, if you will, calm down this fervor. And I think that's the role to be expected from the panel going forward. Next, I would like to invite Ms. Aoki of IJUS to come to the floor. We heard about international efforts. We also heard about the various activities on the part of developed countries in order to improve resource efficiency. Now, Ms. Aoki, I'm sure will focus then on the efforts on the part of the developing countries. How can developing countries actively tackle resource efficiency issues? Ms. Aoki, please. Thank you very much. My name is Aoki with IJUS. Thank you so much for taking part in ISAP. As was mentioned by Mr. Hota, I would like to talk about the issue of resource efficiency. And based on the two presentations, I'm sure you will understand that there's a growing international demand for resource efficiency policies. Then what about resource efficiency policies in Asia? What should be considered? Also, in pursuing resource efficiency policies, what opportunities are there? I would like to share with you some data and scrutinize this issue. So, as a way of introduction, as was covered by the other speakers, when it comes to resource efficiency, I believe it has gained ground in terms of the agenda at the global environmental policy. When it comes to EU, Germany, and Austria, they have newly developed resource efficiency strategy. And this is a fairly new trend, which became evident in the last 2 or 3 years. Now, in China and Japan, the so-called 3R policies, recycling-oriented policies have been implemented. So resource efficiency has long been considered as part of 3R. At UNEP and OECD, green economy indicator and green growth indicator were addressed. But resource efficiency indicator became part of the headline indicator at UNEP and at OECD. So I think you'll find that resource efficiency is taking center stage in terms of global environmental policy agenda. At IJUS, a few years ago, we carried out a research on this topic. Resource efficient policies. The countries that have very active resource efficiency policies, what characteristics do they have? We try to capture that on this chart. You'll find manufactured goods. That's on the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis. We show you the net export of resources. Japan, Germany, and Austria. These are countries with very active, proactive resource efficiency policies, are shown on the bottom right. In other words, we have net export of manufactured goods, but we have net import of resources. In particular, manufacturing accounts for a very large part of total GDP. So these countries tend to be clustered in this area. These are the countries that are very active in terms of resource efficiency policies. So countries with that type of structure tend to be very sensitive in terms of resource efficiency. Maybe that is the reason for that. Then what about the situation in Asia? We try to capture this on this chart. Okay, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, and Singapore are already on the right-hand side block. As for Indonesia, they are a very resource-rich country, so therefore it is placed toward the top left. Indonesia is considered to be the so-called next 11 that follows BRICS, or part of the VISTA countries. So Indonesia is always included. And also, Indonesia is a country that has a large population following China and India. So therefore, Indonesia also is correction. So that being the case, we have decided to focus on Indonesia, but we focus on resource efficiency agenda in Asia. So let me talk about Indonesia. Horizontal axis shows GDP, vertical axis indicates DMC. So how much materials and resources are being consumed? That is it. And you'll find the blocks. So the average GDP and average consumption of resources are indicated. So the framework shows the size of the industrial sector and the manufacturing sector. It shows you the scale of the industry. Now, in the case of 2008, we have the numbers for Indonesia on a standalone basis. As far as scale is concerned, from the 1970s, compared against, it's lower than Japan back in the 1970s. However, by 2025, Indonesia will reach GDP on par with Japanese GDP. So that's the target that Indonesia has set. So if resource consumption continues in line with the growth in Indonesia GDP, what will happen? It means that a very large amount of resource will be consumed in Indonesia, and that is the concern. Now the red part has been expanded. It's the same chart, but you'll find the yellow, light yellow, and the purple. The manufacturing sector and the industrial sector growth are enormous, as you can see. This is very clearly indicated based on the size of the circle. And this is captured on this chart as well. This shows the outstanding industrialization rate as percentage of total GDP. Indonesia, the light green. In the case of Indonesia, ordinarily, it would actually follow the light blue line, in the asterisk line. That is the category that they belong to, the so-called low middle income country. Ordinarily, Indonesia would belong to this bracket, but you'll find that compared against their category, the percentage of an industrial sector to total GDP is enormously high in Indonesia. It means that the Indonesian economic structure really requires a very large amount of resource consumption. Also, as was mentioned earlier, Indonesia is a very populous country. It has 240 million people, and going forward, they're likely to have 300 million population. So orange shows the total population in Indonesia, and we show the population age from 15 to 64 in Indonesia. It's a working population. And the working population accounts for a very large amount of the total population in Indonesia. It is still at the population bonus stage, whereby the percentage of manufacturing and industrial sector is very high. So therefore, that means that we can continue to expect further growth in Indonesia's industrial sector going forward. So therefore, they are now at a stage where they have to give due consideration to resource efficiency. So as a result, what type of consumption grew in Indonesia? We try to capture that on this chart. So data of 1970 is set at 1. The purple line shows metal. In particular, industrial minerals are showing a very strong spike. As far as GDP growth is concerned, that's shown in the blue line, light blue line. You'll find that the growth in the consumption of metal ores and industrial minerals outpace that. Maybe because of that impact, this is what happened. Indonesia is a resource-rich country. It is exporting metals. But this chart shows net exports. Purple in metal, red shows construction minerals, and the blue shows biomass. And the green line shows fossil fuels. As far as fossil fuels is concerned, because of rich oil production, it continues to export this. But when it comes to metal, for many years, metal were imported, although it is now beginning to export metals recently. But compared against oil, how can I say? They continue to rely on imported metals. Now, going forward, what will happen to this trend? And we did some research. So we took a look at the penetration rate of infrastructure and durable consumer goods in blue for Indonesia, and the red shows Malaysia, a middle-income country, and purple shows OECD average. So if you compare these bar graphs, it will become very evident that Indonesia will continue to consume durable consumer goods, and that the number of automobiles are likely to increase in Indonesia in the future. Railways, as far as infrastructure is concerned, they will continue to consume resource. Metal and minerals have shown a very strong increase in demand in Indonesia, and this trend is likely to continue down the road. Then, how can Indonesia improve its resource efficiency? And one major topic is this. This shows the source of waste in Japan. The so-called municipal waste only accounts for 10%. Remaining 90% are the so-called industrial waste. This is not just limited to Japan. It applies to all the developed countries, such as the EU. And in the case of EU, 90% are from non-residential sector. Waste comes from a non-residential sector. Then what about the relationship between industrial waste and GDP? This is shown on this chart. Perhaps it's a given, but the more growth you have, then the more industrial waste will be generated. Where is Indonesia on this chart? It's still toward the extreme left. Extreme on the left-hand side, around here within this cluster. We just have data about Indonesia's GDP. We don't have information about industrial waste in Indonesia. So therefore, in any event, as the GDP growth continues, it is likely that industrial waste generation will expand. So that means that this represents a very large 3R potential. So let me summarize. When we consider resource-efficient Indonesia, what are some of the considerations that would be required? I try to capture that on this chart, or on this page. Poverty reduction and growth. This, I believe, is the assumption. But Indonesia will have to confront large population and also very high industrialization rate and increasing rate of consumption of durable consumer goods. So even from this stage, Indonesia will have to consider infrastructure and lifestyles that are very resource efficient. Also, resource consumption is likely to increase. Indonesia is both a producer and an importer of resources. So it is susceptible to environmental impact of when resources are extracted. So that needs to be borne in mind. And also, as a result of consumption, there is the likelihood of increased industrial waste. So against that backdrop, what opportunities may exist? For example, in the industrial process, how can we prevent waste? How can we cut back on the amount of resources to be utilized? We should consider those methodologies right now. So even at this stage, they have to invest in recycling industry at the 3 Rs and create such a mechanism. I believe this is very critical for Indonesia. Now, what are some of the next steps? In the short to medium term, in Japan, we have the so-called ESCOs, or efficiency service companies. How can we consider resource saving? We need such companies that are able to offer consulting services. Also, within the manufacturing sector, companies that use recycled materials are there. But we need to further pursue this approach. And also, Ricoh, Nissan, these multinational companies perhaps could push utilization of secondary materials in the manufacturing sector. Also, we need infrastructures that can cater to resource efficiency. We also need to consider resource-efficient lifestyles. But Indonesia, being a very populous country, no matter how much resource efficiency they may practice, if they continue to consume, then absolute amount of consumption will continue to grow. So therefore, in the longer term, at what level should resource consumption in Indonesia converge? And that's the question that needs to be considered. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aoki. The examples of Indonesia have been used to talk about the possibility of raising the resource efficiency in the developing countries with specific data. You talked about the possibility and the importance of such efforts. Resource efficiency and resource use. When we talk about recycling, there is little data available. That is why it is difficult to know what kind of policy intervention is possible. However, you can come up with such excellent data if you make effort. That was a very good example. Now let's move on to the discussant, Mr. Onogawa, who is a senior fellow of IGES. Based on all the presentations that have been given now, Mr. Onogawa is going to give his comments. Also, he has been taking leadership in Asia region in terms of the 3 R's activity. Mr. Onogawa, thank you. IGES or ISAP 2013, the green economy has been taken up as a major theme for this year's ISAP meeting. When we talk about green economy, looking back, sustainable development, how are you going to achieve sustainable development? And for that purpose, the green economy has been positioned as a meaningful tool to achieve that goal. In this session, what we are discussing is about finite resources. How efficiently could we use a limited amount of resources in order to sustain a standard of living? And by so doing, we would like to achieve the sustainable development of that world. From that perspective, we are having this discussion. As was introduced earlier, 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle. This concept has been disseminated, and I worked very hard to disseminate that concept throughout this region. Therefore, basically, I am complete in agreement with the direction that has been mentioned in this region throughout my career. However, my role today is to speak as a discussant. So in order to deepen the discussions so far, I would like to take this opportunity to raise several points and also share with you my views in order to stimulate following discussion. So by presenting deliberately antithesis, I would like to advance discussion after my comment. That is my role. First of all, when we talk about 3 R's, as have been mentioned by many speakers, 3 R's has been initiated and proposed by Japan actually as a concept. In the area of environment, I don't know any other areas. However, in the area of environment, Japan has come up with this terminology or concept, which is quite rare for Japan to take the lead. And 3R Forum in Asia is working successfully, and also within Rio Plus 20 outcome document included the concept of 3 R's as well. In Latin America, in Africa as well, 3 R's concept is taking root and following Asia. So in that sense, we are positioned to lead the world in terms of the 3 R's, and I think we can take pride in that. Now, can I have my slide? I have only one page slide. This is it. Actually, this is often what is used by Ministry of the Environment of Japan. You can download this from the website of the ministry. The question is, the amount of resources that we can use is limited in terms of absolute amount. And in this resource constraint, how efficiently are we going to use that? However, we want to have a satisfactory standard of living. We don't want to sacrifice too much the standard of livings. But we have to reduce resource consumption, and also we have to reduce the negative impacts coming out of our day-to-day activities onto environment. And for that purpose, we would like to use resources effectively and efficiently. That is the concept of 3 R's. I show you fiscal 2000 and 2009. This is the case of Japan. In the case of fiscal 2000, the biggest problems over here, this side. This is the amount of resources that Japan incorporated into the Japanese society. Upper half is import, and that is to say we imported these resources from other countries, and lower half represent domestic resources. And this is the amount of resources we consume to sustain our life. And as a result of consumption of these resources, returned to a final disposal. I think you can see final disposal. This is the wastes that have been disposed of in the final stage. So in 2009, this input amount has shrunk quite a lot, as you can see. So all in all, another point is a final disposal amount that has reduced by a factor of 3 or 4. That means Japanese society for the 10-year period from 2000 and 2009, the input of resources has declined, and also impact on the environment in terms of the amount of final disposal has been reduced to this extent. So we reduced impact on environment to this extent. We managed to do that. The point is, in terms of the well-being of our life or the affluence of our life, the amount of flow over here, we use a lot of resources, and we are able to lead the fulfilling standard of living because of this input. So even if we can reduce input and output, we are able to satisfy, we can be satisfied with our way of life. So I think we should expand, reuse, or recycle flow. That is the 3 R's. Reduce, reuse, and recycle. That is the basic concept of 3 R's. So we are able to reduce input as well as output while expanding 3 R's activities in this way, yet we can maintain satisfactory way of life. Now going back to the main discussion point, as I explained just now, looking at the result of the efforts we have been making, if we can press forward with 3 R's, or taking a step further, if we can promote the efficient use of resources, could we solve fundamentally the problems we are facing? That is the fundamental question we have to ask ourselves, because the concept of efficient use of resources does not have a cap. So we are trying to use resources in a more efficient and more wise way, but we are having an increase of population and increase of economic scale. As a result, the amount of resources we are going to use will increase eventually. That means we are going to breach planetary boundary, if you will. Just like a climate change issue, we have a finite resources. By introducing certain solutions, that doesn't mean that we are providing a final answer, a final solution to the problem. We have to consider how much is the resources we are able to use. So 3 R's and the efficient use of resources, when we consider these issues, that kind of perspective has to be borne in mind. Also, as we have been discussing in the case of Japan and Germany, the resource efficiency is maintained by these countries. So I think we have reached the plateau, if you will, according to many people. We use that terminology such as footprint. We are importing things from other countries. For example, by importing beef and beef products, we have to consider feed, including soybeans, and also water resources as well. By importing beef products, it is tantamount to importing water resources and feeds. Therefore, we even if we have come to the plateau in terms of the resource consumption, we also have to consider materials embedded in trade in this way. Even so, the quality of life and also material affluence, even if we don't consider this, Bhutan has a G&H concept, which is rather difficult concept to understand. So resource efficiency and 3 Rs being discussed, that in itself goes a long way. So I think discussion on these issues, resource efficiency and 3 Rs, is a very good starting point. But however, at the end of the day, we want to reconcile, we want to achieve decoupling economic development from environmental degradation, as people have been discussing in the UNEP International Resource Panel is promoting decoupling, as was mentioned in the previous session. Is it really possible to achieve decoupling? That also needs to be verified, and I hope we would be able to deepen discussion on that point as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you offered 3 comments. First, is 3 Rs sufficient? Maybe we need to put some brakes, if you will. Other brakes will be necessary, because unless that is the case, although we could improve efficiency, perhaps consumption of resources continue to exponentially grow. That's the first point. Issue, the hidden impact. Since trade is being carried out on a global basis, one economy's efficiency could be improved. However, it could be at the expense of using resources of other countries and could actually impact the environmental situation in other countries. So what about the hidden flow? How do we address that? I believe that's the second issue raised. And the third point you raised. How do you maintain quality of life and pursue decoupling? Is decoupling really feasible? Can you make economic growth and resource consumption, can you decouple that? I believe that was the third point you raised. So where should we start with our discussion? Would anybody care to volunteer? First was a question pertaining to, is 3 R alone sufficient? Mr. Blashwitz, any comments?
Well, thank you. Well, at this point in our discussion, I would like to be brief. 3R is certainly not sufficient, but we can go a long way with it. And there needs to be more coordinated efforts, in particular for product innovation and system type of innovation, and probably also some lifestyle changes, at least in the affluent world.
Mr. Xiao-Yi, on the first point, is 3R sufficient? Do we need other breaks? Or how do you what about decoupling? Is it possible to pursue decoupling and make it compatible with maintaining lifestyles?
Thank you. Firstly, decoupling, this concept was not invented by UNEP, which was mentioned earliest by OECD report. They want to mention, at that time they called it de-link. Basically the same thing. Now, secondly, decoupling, so-called relatively decoupling, which is mentioned basically the GDP growth and also the resources efficiency has been taking place. It's a fact. Because of the technology innovation, you have more technology, you became more productive. So decoupling has been realized. But this kind of realization has been far and offset by the rapid growth of the resources used in general and by the so-called rebound effect. That's one thing. And at this moment, decoupling, we think decoupling at least at the 3 levels. One is the technology level. Mention you used sufficient, very efficient technology to reduce the resources used for same output, which is the technology. And also, as we call the meso level, which is more for the sectoral and for the region. This is another level of decoupling. Thirdly, we are look at the economy-wide, the whole economy structure, the decoupling. In some country, at some sector, the decoupling has been realized. For instance, the water use. In Australia, in Singapore, in Israel, they realized their GDP grows very fast, their water intensity, so the use of water has been coming down. It is realized, but it's far from enough. For the economic scale, economic-wide, actually, the country, OECD country, in terms of those countries' resources intensity has been reduced. Their resources productivity increased very much. But by the way of the shifting the burden from the developed country to the developing country, this kind of the burden shift, we don't consider that as a real decoupling. So in order to address the decoupling, we have to address systematically, not only address one sector, one country, you have to look into the global scale.
Thank you very much. Mr. Onogawa mentioned the second point, which is the following. So by raising resource efficiency, the question is, are we going to transfer the problems to other countries? Maybe hidden problems would be transferred to other countries. I would like to answer that question from my part. At the IGES for 3 years, we conducted a research for 3 years. In order to avoid that kind of situation, international cooperation is very important. We came to the conclusion. By doing international cooperation, we are able to reduce the use of resource use, and we are able to raise benefits of using resources. Why is it that international cooperation is necessary? As Dr. Bleischwitz mentioned earlier, mentioned in his presentation, and also in Mr. Xiaoyi Li's presentation, also it was mentioned, comprehensive and systematic efforts is necessary in order to solve the problem. And since such efforts is necessary at the global level because trade is an international trade. So I think this issue is going to become more and more important in the context of international cooperation going forward. Now, we have just went around of the panel, and at this point in time, I would like to open the floor for questions, since this is a very good opportunity.
Thank you, Hiro from Seikyo University. I'm also advisor to IGES. I was listening to all the presentations today, all four speakers. It was very informative. Thank you very much. Now, there is one issue which was not covered today in our discussion, very critical point which was not raised. So let me share with you at that point. In our discussion today, this is something that actually started as early as the early 1900s. The issue of metal mining, environmental issues, this dates back to the early 1900s. And also back in the 1950s toward 1960s, Japan was enjoying very rapid growth. Well, Keizai Doyukai pursued resource efficiency because we were consuming so much resources. So we need to pursue efficiency. So this led to the energy revolution in the 1970s. So resource efficiency and recycling. Again, these are very new initiatives, and I would like to applaud your contribution. But the very last point that was discussed, global resource governance. I believe this is a very important issue and challenge. And at Rio Plus 20, I propose Global Commons initiative. And maybe within the concept of global commons, we could address resource governance. But then this was rejected. They all said that under the current market economic system, this was not possible. But on top of this governance, I would like to propose one other issue. Let me cite one example. Natural rubber. In the case of natural rubber, there's enormous use, especially after the Second World War and during the Korean War. And then we decided to launch synthetic rubber in response to that. In other words, by introducing new technology, you can introduce something to replace finite resources. So back then we used petroleum, and back then petroleum only cost maybe $1.25 per barrel. It was very cheap back then. Now, having said all this, and by the way, there is the so-called substitution effect. The substitution effect. And in the discussion today, there was no mention of substitution effect. I was just wondering to what extent substitution effect could play a role in recycling, resource efficiency, and resource governance type of discussion. So I would appreciate any comments from any of the panelists on the notion of substitution effect, especially in relation to resource efficiency, recycling, governance, and substitutions. And so as far as substitution is concerned, do you have any comments? What are your thoughts? I would appreciate your inputs. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Maybe we'll take one more question or comment before we go on to the response by the panelists. So we'll take one more comment or question.
I am Tomonobu Global. Resource efficiency and decoupling. The advanced countries' GDP, 60% of it comes from personal spending. And in developing countries, in order to achieve higher economic growth, a consumption-driven society is something they want to model after. However, on that model, energy will be spent in a significant amount. However, in order to sustain economy, what needs to be done? In other words, as Mr. Onogawa said earlier, the quality of life has to be improved. If we want to improve the quality of life, not based on material and resource consumption. Rather, we have to look at it from functional perspective. As Mr. Aoki Miss Aoki said, we can produce more with less resources. That kind of lifestyle has to be invented. Your own culture, your own history has to be the basis of your innovation in order to come up with a new way of life cycle. As Mr. Shaoli said, the urbanization in the developing countries, there will be a concentration of people, and heat island phenomenon could be caused, and also it could negatively affect people's health. So we have to consider what is really the quality of life. We have to consider function of way of life. And so we have to research it systematically and cross-border way. So infrastructure and people's infrastructure operation has to be considered. So not only consuming things in our society, but we have to focus on functions of infrastructure and other components of the society. We have to strike a balance in terms of the various elements of the society, because population is increasing and urbanization is progressing in a massive way. So we cannot follow the urbanization or the development pattern that developed countries have followed. So we have to come up with a new model.
We have very limited time, so we can only invite very short comment from each panelist. So substitution of products and functions. Is this addressed? Maybe Mr. Shaoli, is this being carried out at the panel? And also one other point was consumption-driven economy. Should we not shift from consumption-driven model to function-driven model and give more consideration to one's local culture? Any comments on these issues? Yes, Mr. Onogawa, if you'd like to start. And then, first, Mr. Shaoli, please. Mr. Shaoli, Mr. Onogawa, and then Mr. Bleichwitz. In that order, please.
Process substitution is certainly a one-way out. but certainly is not the only way out. It's a short answer to your question. And when we do the substitution, there's one issue we need to address, which is the nexus issue, which is you substitute at what cost. I mean the economic cost, material cost, and the environment cost. That we need to take into account. We do a study. We look into the renewable energy. Renewable energy in terms of the GHG mitigation is wonderful, much better than the conventional energy. But in terms of the resources of material consumption, some are good, some not so good. For instance, we find out, in terms of the land use, the wind farm use less land than coal mining, because coal mining, they used a lot of wood as a pillar in the cutting phase. So that is the life cycle approach. Meanwhile, we find out, the wind power, windmill, wind turbine, and the PV panel, they use more resources, more material. In terms of the kilowatt capacity, generating capacity, that will be 2 or 3 times more than conventional energy. Then we look at one issue. If we want to scale up the renewable energy, put the solar panel on every roof, put the windmill on every coast area, what is the impact on the resources use? I show this example just mentioned. When we consider substitution or change, you consider holistically, consider the nexus issue. Another point, is a good point. Only address the issue from the production part is far from enough. We have to consider the consumption part. That's why just now I mentioned 3 points. Last 2 is do more for less, do less for less. Whether this do less for less used the concept of the degrowth or others, that can be debated. But we should consume less. Whenever you travel, like us, travel around, whenever we hear we are talking about the environment, surveys, very upbeat, encouraging. Whenever I step into the airport, so this kind of the brand, luxury goods, I feel so depressed. That is consumption driven. That's why, in the Rio Plus 20, in Rio, last June, only one official document which is adopted. The Rio Plus 20, future we want is accepted. Only one solution was adopted, which is we call the 10YFP, the 10-year program framework for sustainable consumption and production. This concept, SCP, sustainable consumption and production, this concept has been generated in first Rio 40 years ago. Never scale up. Because, people, developing countries mention consumption is you developed countries' problem. We are facing starvation. It is your problem. We emphasize production first, then look into how do we have a sustainable consumption. Now, this concept changed. People want to look into production and consumption from the whole life cycle. The paradigm has been changed. Now, our priority is how to change, how to translate this change into action on the ground.
Okay, thank you. Just one comment each from the Onoga-san and the Brush Business, because
time constraint.
Yeah, time constraints.
The second question, I don't have an answer to provide to you to the second question because we have a finite resources and materials, therefore mentally, and also you mentioned function orientation. Maybe that is one example of a way out in order not to magnify this problem. So I completely agree with you, 100%. However, easier said than done though. I would like to cite 2 examples to illustrate that point. One is India. I organized a workshop like this in India in the past. The learned people are, of course, the major players in such a workshop. About 100 or 200 people participated in that workshop. We discussed the transportation mode, and somebody said, not passenger car, not with your own car, we should use public transportation. He said, everybody says that we have to use public transportation, but we would like to have our own car. On holidays and weekend, we want to drive our own car. And based on that, after having done that, we want to participate in the activities you proposed. And one person said that, and the other people, 199 people, opposed to that idea. However, I think that is a human desire. At the very deep inside yourself, I think everybody has that kind of desire. It's difficult to deny that. That is first example. And the second example is about Bhutan, gross national happiness, not economic development, but the gross national happiness is the indicator that Bhutan use. However, even in that country, TVs are disseminating, and through TV programs, people came to know affluent level enjoyed by other countries. So people in Bhutan want to have a material wealth. That is why there is a piles of wastes here and there on the street in Bhutan now. So conceptually, I agree with you. Conceptually, I want to promote what you have indicated. And I think as a leader, I think we have to raise the banner to lead the people. However, if we go inside the heart of each and every person, we cannot deny the desire people have for material wealth.
最後に一言。
Mr. Blashwitz, one last word, please.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for all those excellent questions and the comments. There was one point which was raised by the first speaker, which I found interesting, on the global resource governance issue. I agree with you that the global commons concept is probably too much straightforward, difficult to implement, but I suggest that there could also be a concept of collective goods, of regional collective goods, of transboundary collective goods, of common heritage of mankind, which is probably better suitable to a number of resources. When it comes to substitutions, I agree that the potential is fairly limited. We did a number of calculations saying that the potential of product design is probably greater, plus indeed that you can hardly shift from a non-renewable to a renewable basis due to land use, biomass constraints, etc. So yes, product design and other systems are more encouraging than substitution, which also leads me then to the last comment. I very much indeed agree that functional thinking is important, but I think for a number of emerging and developing countries, this might be a very sophisticated concept. And I think we learned this morning that with the resource efficiency agenda, you could also combine a number of environmental indicators that can be reduced together with public and private health issues, with local security issues. So this resource nexus and resource efficiency on the ground can also be well delivered by small-scale initiatives which can be disseminated, which contribute to functional developments indeed, but it's much more basic than the thoughts about functional product development. So nevertheless, I very much agree. To bridge the gap, eventually urbanization, you could also think of gardening and agriculture within urban areas, greening the city. So these are also some ideas of how resource efficiency in a wider understanding could also be brought into cities. Thank you.
ありがとうございました、皆様。
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. We have to conclude at this juncture. Now, green economy, which is the agenda set by ISAP. Low carbon low energy, low resource consumption, and a more inclusive community. That's what we're trying to pursue. But in all these sessions, we talk about low carbon. This is the only session within ISAP where we take up energy correction, resource efficiency. I know that you have not been able to fully exhaust the discussion. I'm sure there are other questions, but we have to conclude at this juncture. Could we show appreciation to the panelists in the usual fashion, please?
Mr. Blashevitz, Mr. Lee, Ms. Aoki, Mr. Onogawa, thank you very much for your contribution. This concludes the program of day 1. If you are coming back tomorrow, please make sure that you bring your pass with you and come to the reception. From 10 o'clock in the morning, we are going to have parallel sessions, including low carbon policies in cities and creation of business opportunities. Please make sure that you leave simultaneous interpretation receiver on the desk before you go out. And also, please check whether you don't have a receiver in your pocket or bag. And beside the escalator, there is a trash bin. So if you have some trash, please take it to the trash bin beside the escalator. Thank you very much for your earnest attendance. Please take everything with you. Thank you very much.